I feel very proud to have played a part in bringing that man, whom I once called Africa's Hitler, to justice. I mean, he had been the epicenter of violence all over sub-Saharan Africa. He had also been very much the acolyte of Gaddafi. He'd been, like many other of those leaders, to the Gaddafi school of terrorism in Tripoli, and so where he'd learnt his business. And they were terrible people. They were terrible people. So actually bringing him to justice gave me a great sort of sense of satisfaction.
You just blew right over the fact that you were involved and pleased to be part of. You were intimately involved in the negotiations for the arrest of Charles Taylor. For the students, he had been indicted, and then he left and went to Nigeria.
Well, he'd taken refuge in Nigeria, and the president of Nigeria basically took up the position that he was not going to surrender this man unless a lawful government in Liberia asked for his return. Of course, at that time, it didn't look as if there was going to be a government in Liberia that would ask for his return. But in due course, there was, of course, a change of government in Liberia, and somebody called Ellen Johnson Sirleaf came to power, a very fine lady who, with a background in the UN, and she did call for the return of Charles Taylor for trial. Of course, that panicked the president of Nigeria, because he was then faced with this promise that he'd given to the international community. Yes, I will surrender Charles Taylor if the lawful government of Liberia asks for him. In fact, he had no business making that condition, because Charles Taylor at that time was an indicted war criminal, and the duty of President Obasanjo, the president of Nigeria, was in fact to hand him over. However, one must remember international politics is such that the West, the United States, and so on and so forth, was very dependent on Nigeria, because in all these operations that were taking place in Africa, where peacekeeping troops were needed, neither the US nor Britain nor France or anybody else wanted to put their own troops in. And Nigeria was putting her troops in order to maintain peace in many cases. So Nigeria was acting as a regional power, in return for which Nigeria was hoping that the Security Council, if expanded, as you all know, there are 5 permanent members of the Security Council who are the most powerful countries within it. Nigeria was hoping to be considered to be, or added to, this number of permanent members of the Security Council. And I took the view that if in fact Nigeria was giving house room to a wanted war criminal, then I would do the same as my counterpart in The Hague was doing, Carlo Del Ponte, who, when Serbia wanted to join the European Union, Carlo Del Ponte said, "No, I will object to that, because you have failed to surrender Mladic and Karadzic and people like that, who at that time were being looked for." I took up the same position with Nigeria and said, I will object to you being considered but by the Security Council, because you are continuing to give house room to a wanted war criminal. And it was on that basis that I eventually got him. Not that Nigeria didn't join become a permanent member of the Security Council. I simply used it as a threat which I thought I should rightly use, because no country should get into the position of being a permanent member of the Security Council if such a country is willing to give house room to an international criminal of this kind.
Tell me about the logistics. I mean, he is housed in Nigeria. You've got to get him back to Liberia, and in turn, ultimately back to Free time.
Yes.
How did that all work?
Well, it worked because...
I mean, I find it so fascinating that you got to move people here.
Yes, well, the moment I took up that position that I waited till President Obasanjo was just about to come to Washington. He was on his way to see President Bush. And about 48 hours before he left, to discuss two things with President Bush. And one of them was he wanted President Bush to consider American support for the inclusion of Nigeria in an expanded Security Council. And he also, I think at that time, wanted American support to run for the third time as president in Nigeria. I wasn't interested whether he ran for the third time or not. But what I did say to the Nigerian ambassador, I said, Mr. Ambassador, I am personally going to take up with the White House the fact that as you give house room to a war criminal, the White House will in fact be collaborating with your government if in fact he is not returned. And I did that 48 hours before Obasanjo left. And of course it had the desired result, because I think I'm right in saying that in Washington, I having gone public, I think I held President Obasanjo entirely responsible for handing over this man, Charles Taylor. It so happened when Obasanjo was about to leave or had left, Charles Taylor was allowed to escape from, and that's when Obasanjo's forces picked him up on the border and took up the position, the model position, that he had breached, Charles Taylor had breached his promise to the then Nigerian government. It's all sort of bluff and double bluff, and it's all a game, really. And so they then handed him over, and I was there to receive him. I remember him being flown in a helicopter, surrounded by 2 helicopter gunships to Freetown, and I was there to receive him. But it all happened very quickly, in about 24 hours, simply by applying the right sort of pressure, otherwise we would never have got him, and this man would never have been brought to trial. Because, and of course, hundreds of thousands of people in Sierra Leone wanted justice, and as far as they were concerned, this was the man who was behind. He was behind, he had assisted, he had promoted, he had actively played an active part, as he was convicted of. Of course, he was acquitted of certain aspects, giving direct instructions and things of that kind, so we must assume that judgment is correct in that regard, but he was certainly convicted of aiding and abetting the terrible crimes that were committed in Sierra Leone. So we wouldn't have had him otherwise, and it's a question of knowing when to apply pressure. And there it is.
It's a riveting story.